My husband, Daniel, and I were cleaning out the storage shed to help my parents move into a bigger house. An old steel box fell, and documents scattered everywhere. When he looked at the paper, his face went pale. He whispered, "Don't react. Wait until your mother gets back." I was in shock as my eyes skimmed the first few lines and uncovered a truth buried for nearly 3 decades. But before I confront the lies within my own family, where are you watching this from? Leave a comment below, and don't forget to like and subscribe, so I can tell you the whole truth. I am Abigail, 28 years old, and I grew up in Morgantown, West Virginia, where the green hills cradle the small wooden houses all year round, where people are used to keeping everything within the family. I always thought of myself as an ordinary person, not as brilliant as my brother Jaden, but not a failure either. I had a stable job in digital media, a loving husband, Daniel, and a fairly solid belief that even if I wasn't spoiled, at least I was part of the family. Jaden is 4 years older than me, and from a young age, he was given everything: private school, tutors, business summer camps. I went to a public university, got my own scholarships, worked part-time jobs to avoid becoming a burden. Even so, I was never spoken of with pride. My parents, Carol and Richard, always looked at Jaden as if he were the light of the family, and I was just a shadow. But I got used to it. I stopped seeking validation a long time ago. Until that day. The day we returned to the old house to help my parents clean up before they moved into their new 4-bedroom lakefront home, the gift they said Jaden gave them for their anniversary. I didn't question much. I just wanted to help pack up the past. This house only had 2 bedrooms, small, but it was where I grew up, with bunk bed nights and mornings filled with my parents arguing over bills. Daniel and I were assigned the basement. It was dark, damp, faintly scented with old paper and rotting wood. While I was fumbling through the cardboard boxes, Daniel accidentally bumped into an old wooden shelf in the back. A rusty steel box sitting atop the shelf fell, hit the floor with a dry, sharp thud. The latch sprang open, the lid flew up, and several documents scattered across the floor. I shot Daniel a glare, shaking my head with a half-smile. "You just broke one of Dad's antiques." Daniel chuckled awkwardly and knelt down to pick up the papers. But when he picked up the last sheet, his expression suddenly changed, and it wasn't from the dust. I saw his eyes freeze, locked on the page like he was hypnotized. I walked over and teased him. "Is that a sexy girl photo that's got you all mesmerized?" No response. "Daniel?" I called again. Then again. It wasn't until the third time that he turned to me and held the page out, wordlessly, slowly nodding. I took it, and as my eyes skimmed the first few lines, a chill ran down my spine. Grantors, Riley Harper and Julian Miller. Beneficiary, Abigail Miller. I froze. Riley and Julian. Names I vaguely remembered hearing in my parents' late-night conversations, always in hushed tones, always assuming I wasn't paying attention. Once I asked who they were, and my mother just said, "Your aunt and uncle. They died in a plane crash when you were just over a year old." Then she quickly changed the subject, as if it wasn't worth discussing. But why did they set up a trust for me? And why was this box hidden deep in the basement of my parents' house, never once mentioned? I clutched the paper tightly, trying to stay calm. For some reason, my whole body felt cold, as if I had accidentally touched a sealed-off memory. I didn't know what I was unlocking, but I knew, from that moment on, everything in my life would never be the same again. I sat down on the basement floor, the paper still trembling in my hands. Daniel carefully gathered the rest of the documents and placed them in my lap. We both stayed silent, as if any sound might shatter what had just been pulled up from the depths of memory. I started flipping through them. Trust formation certificate, beneficiary identification records, periodic disbursement logs, and a typed letter bearing the names of the grantors, Riley Harper and Julian Miller. Issuing bank, a trust institution in Boston, Massachusetts. I had never lived in Boston. I had never heard my parents mention ever living there. Even the name Julian was nothing more than a distant echo in my mind, a name that once flickered through a story, only to be immediately extinguished. The documents clearly stated, the trust was established when I was born, to ensure financial stability until adulthood. The strange thing was, 30% of the fund had been disbursed when I turned 18, just as the term stated, but I had never known of it, never received a cent. The current balance of the trust, according to the latest update, was still 70%, and it was scheduled for automatic transfer on my 28th birthday, just a few days from now. I looked at Daniel, my voice hoarse. I don't understand. If this trust really exists, why have I never heard of it? Why was it hidden? Daniel didn't answer, but his eyes said it all. He, too, was beginning to doubt things we once thought were indisputable. I turned to a page with bold letters. Designated guardian. Temporary custody, if trustees pass. Carol Miller and Richard Miller. My chest tightened. A wavering feeling, like everything I had ever believed was slowly drifting off the ground. If Riley and Julian created the trust, and my parents were named as guardians in the event of their death, then it meant they weren't just aunt and uncle, like I was told. I could no longer form words. A question began to take shape inside me, slowly, chillingly, but painfully clear. Who am I in this family? I held the stack of documents in my hands and walked out of the basement, unable to remember how many steps I'd climbed. Daniel followed me silently. Everything in the house still seemed peaceful. My mother was wrapping up some old tablecloths. My father was taking down the familiar curtains that had shaded me throughout high school. No one knew that just a few walls away, a piece of the truth had crumbled in my hands. We didn't say anything to them, at least not then. Instead, I brought the files into the bedroom I once called mine and shut the door. Daniel sat on the bed while I spread the papers out on the floor, one page at a time, line by line, trying to piece together something that made sense. I reread the timelines. The trust was created when I was born. Riley and Julian clearly stated that if they passed, all assets would be transferred to me through a trust, temporarily managed by the guardians, Carol and Richard, until I came of age. The problem was, they never handed the trust over when I turned 18. They kept it. They withdrew 30%, and I never benefited from any of it. They hid it. Suddenly, I remembered something from a few years ago, when the roof leaked after a spring storm. I'd heard my mother yell in the kitchen, "Do you think we have a money printer?" when my dad suggested fixing it right away. They once had a fierce argument over a few $1,000s. I used to think, maybe my parents were truly struggling. But now? Now they were preparing to move into a 4-bedroom lakefront home with a large glass window facing the water, imported oak floors, and a balcony my mom said was big enough for 3 tea sets. They said Jaden bought it for them. Jaden, who had only started his company a few years ago, never mentioned any major investments and was never one to live frugally. I looked at Daniel. "Do you see anything odd?" Daniel didn't answer immediately. He leaned against the bed frame, eyes on the ceiling, then slowly nodded. "Jaden doesn't have that kind of cash. His company just hired new staff. If he had that much money, he'd invest it, not buy a house for your parents." I was silent. A quiet hypothesis crept into me. Sinister, yet chillingly plausible. They were planning to use the remaining 70% of the trust fund to pay for that house, and if I hadn't stumbled upon it, then in just a few days, on my birthday, the entire amount would be withdrawn legally, since I'd be 28. And I would never know. They would move, live peacefully by the lake on what Riley and Julian left behind, while I'd continue believing I was just a guest in my own life. I sat there, in an old room with white walls stained by time, and I understood. I had been deceived, not just about money, but about my own origins. I folded the documents and placed them in my backpack. I didn't zip it. Part of me wanted my parents to see it, to ask, "What's that?" So I'd have a reason to begin the conversation I knew was inevitable. But that night no one asked. At dinner everything went on as usual. My mom asked Daniel if he was hungry. My dad talked about running into an old neighbor who used to work with him at the mechanical plant. No one noticed I didn't touch my food, and I didn't blame them. They were too used to me being silent. After dinner, I went into the kitchen where my mother was wiping down the sink. I stood behind her for a while. "Mom," I spoke softly, "I want to ask you something." She turned around, her smile tired but gentle. "Yes, sweetie?" I took a breath and asked directly, "Do you remember anyone named Riley and Julian?" A few seconds. Just a few, but enough to catch her face freeze before she laughed. "Oh my, why are you asking about that? They were your aunt and uncle. They died when you were a baby, on a work trip or something. Plane crash." "How old was I?" I pressed. "About a year old, give or take. You wouldn't remember." She laughed again, a little forced this time. "Did you find something?" I didn't have time to answer before my father walked in. "What's going on?" I looked at him, then at her. "I found an old metal box in the basement. Documents about a trust fund, created by Riley and Julian. I'm the beneficiary." My father was silent for a few seconds. Then, like someone had hit a reset button, he waved it off. "Oh, that stuff's just nonsense. They probably meant to leave you a couple hundred, like a little savings for the future. But they died suddenly, so I guess it never mattered." "Not a couple hundred, Dad," I said slowly. "It's a trust fund, established when I was born. Part of it was withdrawn when I turned 18. There's still 70% left, scheduled for transfer on my 28th birthday." They both looked at me, no longer pretending to be surprised. My mother put the dishcloth down. My father scratched his chin. I asked directly, "Why didn't you ever tell me?" My mother walked to the table, pulled out a chair, and sat down. "Abigail, it's more complicated than you think. When Riley and Julian died, everyone was devastated. Your father and we didn't take you in for the money. We took you in because you were an innocent child." I went still. They had just admitted it. No beating around the bush. No more hiding. "So, I'm not your biological daughter?" I asked. She nodded slowly. My father chimed in. "But you're our daughter, since you were learning to walk. Don't let a few papers make you think otherwise." I said nothing. I turned away, went straight upstairs, letting their words scatter behind me like broken bricks. I didn't know what hurt more, knowing I'd been lied to, or realizing they thought I'd never find out the truth. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual. I couldn't sleep. All night, my mother's words kept spinning in my head. "It's more complicated than you think. Your father and I didn't take you in for the money." But not once did she apologize. Not once did they say I should have been told the truth, that I had the right to know who I was. I stepped out onto the back porch where Jaden was standing with his coffee. He wore a white shirt and khakis, hair neatly combed, looking every bit the successful son our parents loved to boast about to the neighbors. I stood beside him, saying nothing. He turned to me, raised an eyebrow. "Up early. Couldn't sleep?" I looked him straight in the eye. "Do you know anything about the trust fund from Riley and Julian?" Jaden paused for a split second, almost imperceptible if you weren't looking closely. "What fund?" he asked again, tone indifferent. I didn't respond. I pulled from my pocket a copy of the disbursement document from when I turned 18 and handed it to him. "This states that 30% of the trust was withdrawn. Purpose: to support a family member taken in by the adoptive family." Jaden skimmed it, then sighed. "Abigail, this... I really didn't know. Maybe Mom and Dad used it for something. I don't know." "And that was the same year you started your company?" I asked. He didn't answer. I pressed on. Do you remember how that year I had to work 3 jobs to pay for school? You drove a new car right after college graduation while I took the bus to class. You went to business summer camp in Denver. I studied online and worked as a kitchen hand. Jaden turned his face away. Abigail, don't make this a big deal. If Mom and Dad used that money to help me, that was their choice. I didn't force them. Didn't force? I almost laughed. You were always the priority, always the chosen one. They said I was selfish for not helping you when your company was struggling. They told me I needed to know my place in the family. And now I see. That place was the rightful heir, stripped of her rights to fund the dream of their real child. Jaden looked at me, and for the first time, he didn't look confident. But instead of apologizing, he just said, I can't control what happened. You should talk to Mom and Dad, not take it out on me. I nodded coldly. You're right. I won't take it out on you. I'll take it out on the truth. I walked away, leaving behind the brother I had spent my whole life trying to catch up to, never realizing the race had never been fair to begin with. That night, I sat alone on the porch. The West Virginia air at the end of December was freezing, but I felt nothing. In my hand was the trust contract copy, the paper that had turned my world upside down in just 2 days. I looked at the house before me, the place I grew up, the place I once thought I belonged. And for the first time, I saw it as an outsider. Those walls didn't protect me. They concealed me. I went inside and saw Daniel sitting by the window, checking his work emails. I placed my hand on his shoulder. We're leaving tomorrow, I said, not waiting for agreement. Daniel wasn't surprised. He just nodded gently. Where do you want to go? I handed him the paper with the bank's name. Marston and Green, Private Trust. Boston, Massachusetts. That's where the trust was created, I said. I need to go there. I need to find out who Riley and Julian really were. They didn't just leave money. They left a will, and I can't let anyone else keep rewriting my story. The next morning, I texted my mom a short message. Daniel and I have urgent business in Boston. We'll be back later. No explanations, no arguments. As I stepped into the car with my backpack, I saw my father standing on the porch, watering some nearly wilted plants. He didn't look at me. I didn't look at him. Daniel put his hand on the wheel, started the engine, and we drove away. No one waved goodbye. On the way to Boston, I opened my phone and began searching for any information I could find on Riley Harper and Julian Miller. Not much came up, just a few old articles, an accident notice from 1998, and a brief line. Young finance couple killed in flight to Singapore. I touched the words, finance couple, and my heart trembled slightly. I didn't know why, but I felt a strange sense of pride, as if I had just uncovered a piece of an identity I was never allowed to have. When the city of Boston came into view, I knew I wasn't here to reclaim the money. I was here to reclaim the truth. And maybe a piece of myself. Boston was colder than I expected. The winds from the Charles River slipped through every seam in my coat, making me shiver slightly as I stepped out of the yellow cab. Marston and Green Bank was housed in an old neoclassical building with white columns and granite steps. Daniel held the door as I walked in. We explained our purpose, to verify information about a trust fund established in the late 1990s. The bank staff, a middle-aged man with half-rim glasses, asked for my ID and copies of the documents. After several verifications, he nodded. Yes, this trust is still valid. You are the listed beneficiary. The transfer of the remaining 70% is scheduled to occur automatically on your 28th birthday, and he paused, then continued. There's a note in the file. If the beneficiary has any questions about the trust's history, they may contact someone named Quinn Harper. I almost froze in place. Harper. Same last name as Riley. Do you have an address or phone number for them? I asked. The bank clerk handed me an old business card, its edges slightly worn. On it read, Quinn Harper. Volunteer. Beacon Hill Community Library. I didn't know if she still worked there, but I needed to go. An hour later, I stood in front of that library. A quiet, brick-red building nestled among a neighborhood of bare maple trees. I pushed the door open. An elderly woman with silver hair, probably in her 60s, was shelving classic novels. As I approached, she looked up, and in that moment, her eyes paused. Are you Abigail? Her voice trembled. I was startled. How do you know my name? Quinn set the book down and stepped closer. You look so much like Riley, especially the eyes. My heart nearly stopped. No one had ever compared me to Riley. I had never known what that woman's face looked like, beyond a blurry photo I had just printed from an online article. You knew Riley? I asked. Quinn nodded gently. Riley was my best friend. We went to college together. I was her maid of honor at her wedding to Julian. I don't even remember when I sat down in the chair by the desk. Quinn poured me a cup of hot tea, then quietly began. Their death was sudden and painful. The flight to Singapore crashed into the Java Sea. No one survived. I sat in silence for 3 seconds, then asked, after my parents, Riley and Julian, died, what happened? Quinn looked down at her hands, rubbed them softly together, then lifted her gaze. When the accident happened, everyone was in shock. Riley and Julian had very few close relatives, but Riley had once mentioned that if anything happened, the baby, you, would be taken in temporarily by Carol and Richard. Just temporarily. Until the funeral passed and the family could figure things out. She paused, her eyes slightly blurred. But the funeral was quick, rushed. No obituary in the paper. No list of notified relatives. Just a few close friends, including me, were invited to a simple memorial at a private funeral home. Everything seemed orchestrated. And then, they disappeared. They took me? I asked. Quinn nodded. You were just over a year old then. I remember it clearly, because that day, Carol was holding you in a cream-colored sweater and a red ribbon hat. I tried to approach, but Carol said you had a fever and it wasn't good to let anyone hold you. A few weeks after the funeral, I went back to Riley and Julian's home, and it was sold. I was stunned. Sold? Yes, Quinn nodded. Listed under emergency work relocation. All the assets were temporarily sealed by a lawyer, but no one pursued legal action. It seems the power of attorney had been signed beforehand. Riley must have trusted them. But when I called, both home numbers were disconnected. I sat in silence. My eyes locked on a line of water dripping down the window. In my memory, I had never known any other house but that 2-bedroom home in Morgantown, and yet, I had once had another home, a house that belonged to people who truly loved me and had left me an entire future. But it had all been taken away. Did you ever try to find me? I asked, almost whispering. Quinn pressed her lips together. I wrote to the bank but received no reply. I registered a missing person alert through the city system but heard nothing. After a while, I started wondering if I had imagined it all. But today, when you walked through that door, I knew I hadn't. I nodded slowly. My tears didn't fall, but I could feel something cracking open inside my chest, not loudly, not violently, just quietly falling apart. Every time I had felt like an outsider in my own family, every time I was scolded for not being like Jaden, every time I worked twice as hard just to earn love, like it was a transaction. All of it had an answer. I wasn't their child. And they knew. They had always known. The next day, Daniel and I went to the law office Quinn had referred us to, a firm specializing in estate management and inheritance law, located in a sleek office building in the Back Bay neighborhood. The man who received us was Lawrence Adler, an elderly attorney with silver hair, a slender build, and sharp eyes. After I laid out everything that had happened, he carefully examined the copies of the trust documents, including the disbursement terms, guardian designations, and a supplemental note the bank had just printed for me. He nodded, fingers tapping lightly on the wooden desk. In your case, legally speaking, this isn't just a matter of asset dispute. It's a textbook example of guardian abuse of authority. If what you're saying is true, that you were never informed of your beneficiary rights, and that 30% of the trust was disbursed while you were still a minor without independent oversight, then that's a blatant violation of trust governance. I swallowed hard and asked softly, "Can I get it back?" Lawrence leaned forward. "Not only can you should, because this isn't just about the money. This is about the integrity of Riley and Julian, who created this trust with a clear intent that these assets were meant for you. If you don't act, the remaining 70% will be transferred on schedule, and anyone with access, Carol or Richard, if they still have the bank credentials, could seize it." I nodded slowly. Daniel held my hand beneath the table. "We can begin by filing a motion to freeze the trust's disbursement and simultaneously request a forensic audit of the 30% already withdrawn. Then, if you agree, we'll file a suit against the former guardians for breach of fiduciary duty, seek damages, and move to reinstate full control of the trust to you." Lawrence paused, as if giving me space to breathe. I closed my eyes. Images from the past flickered across my mind like a hazy film. Nights spent studying under a dim yellow light. My mother lamenting rent, while Jaden boasted about buying a new laptop. All of it now reframed in a new light. The light of betrayal. I opened my eyes and looked directly at the lawyer. "I want to proceed." He nodded. "We'll coordinate with the bank to temporarily freeze the trust. You'll need to appear in court in West Virginia, since that's the current residence of the guardians, to file the complaint." I left the office with a folder in my hands, but my heart felt heavier than ever. I wasn't the type who liked lawsuits. I hated confrontation. But for the first time, I knew. Silence was no longer an option, and if I didn't seek justice for myself, then maybe I would spend the rest of my life living a story someone else had written for me. After nearly a week in Boston, I returned to my parents' house in Morgantown to collect a few sentimental belongings, but I was no longer the silent woman who had walked out of that house days earlier. As the car turned onto the familiar road, littered with winter leaves, I saw the small two-bedroom house I once called home. Now it looked like a dated model, flipped over by the very hands that had built it. Daniel gently squeezed my hand, a quiet reminder that I was no longer alone. The first hearing was held at Monongalia County Court, not very large, but bright and notably packed. News of the case had spread once the complaint was made public. Locals came out of curiosity because they had known Riley and Julian, or to witness a confrontation between daughter and her parents. I sat beside Attorney Lawrence, hands tightly clasped. Carol and Richard entered from the opposite door, accompanied by a local lawyer I recognized from the town notary's office. My mother looked at me, her expression unreadable. My father didn't look at me at all. When the judge struck the gavel, the hearing began. Lawrence made a brief statement. His client, me, was the rightful beneficiary of a trust fund established by her biological parents, Riley and Julian, and was petitioning to freeze disbursement and investigate the unauthorized use of 30% of the fund, as well as reclaim full control. Evidence was presented: a copy of the trust's terms, the disbursement record from when I was 18, and confirmation from Marston and Green Bank. When their lawyer stood up, he began with a professionally sympathetic tone. "My clients, Mr. and Mrs. Miller, raised Abigail from infancy when she had no one. Their actions were not malicious, but driven by what they believed was best for the child. All expenses, even those involving their son, were family decisions, not personal gain." I clenched my fists. Lawrence rose to counter. Intent does not override legal obligation, especially when a guardian withdraws funds without informing the beneficiary. This is not just an ethical lapse. This is a breach of fiduciary responsibility. Carol burst into tears. She looked at me and spoke loudly, without the microphone. You don't understand, Abigail. When Riley and Julian died, no one wanted to take in a baby. We did what no one else would. We loved you like our own. I looked directly at her, my voice cold. If you loved me like your own, why hide the truth my entire life? Why use my birth parents' money to help someone else without asking me? The courtroom fell silent. Richard still said nothing. He just sat there, stone-faced, avoiding my gaze. When the judge ruled to approve a temporary freeze on the trust and scheduled a full hearing in the coming weeks, I exhaled like someone who had just stepped onto the first stair of a towering staircase. I didn't know if I would win, but I knew. From this point forward, they would no longer get to write my story for me. I stepped out of the courthouse as the pale afternoon sunlight filtered through the bare winter trees. Daniel was still beside me, but I felt as if I were walking alone through a land I once called home, now strange and cold. As we reached the parking lot, I saw Jaden waiting. He was leaning against his sleek black SUV, a vehicle I knew was partly funded by the family financial support our parents always talked about. He said nothing as I approached, just looked at me with a mix of defensiveness and weariness. You won, he said. Not yet, I replied. This is just the beginning. Jaden sighed, his voice lower than usual. I didn't think it would go this far. I thought, you'd let it go. Like always. Because I always did, I said. That's why everyone thought I'd stay quiet forever. I looked him in the eye. You knew that 30% of the trust was used to start your company, didn't you? Jaden didn't deny it. I didn't ask for it. Mom and Dad offered. I thought it was from some savings. You thought, or you chose not to ask, I said sharply. We're adults, Jaden. No one's naive enough to think hundreds of thousands of dollars fall from the sky without a source. He looked away. I never thought of you as an outsider. I truly saw you as my sister. I gave a bitter smile. And yet, when your company succeeded, I was the first asked to contribute more. Because family comes first. No one asked if I had money. They just assumed I'd give, that I'd sacrifice. Jaden lowered his head, silent for a long time. Finally, he spoke slowly. If you really reclaim what's yours, what will you do with it? I didn't hesitate. I'll keep what belongs to me. No more, no less. I won't take anything from you, like everyone once did to me. He nodded faintly. So, you're taking this all the way to court? I'm not dragging it to court, I said. I'm just not backing down anymore. Jaden looked at me, perhaps for the first time, with real respect, not because I had the upper hand, but because I was no longer avoiding the fight. I stepped back toward Daniel and opened the car door. Before getting in, I turned to Jaden. I don't hate you, but I no longer believe that you're my family, at least not in the way everyone used to define it. He froze, as if someone had dropped a pebble into his heart, not enough to break it, but enough to make it pause. Then what do you think family means? He asked. I smiled, softly but firmly. It's the place where no one has to trade their identity just to be loved. The car door closed, Daniel started the engine, and I sat silently, watching the road stretch out before me. No one stood behind me anymore. But no one was in my way either. Daniel drove us back to the apartment we had rented in the suburbs. We had lived there for nearly 3 years, but I had never truly felt it was home. Until now. No more guilt-ridden glances, no more reproachful voices, calling me selfish. No more family dinners where I was always the one cleaning up last. Every morning, I woke up early, made coffee, opened the window, and took in the crisp winter air of the new year. Daniel continued his remote work, and I took 2 weeks off. Not to run away, but to stand still. I reorganized drawers, sorted documents, made extra copies of all the trust-related papers, and stored them on a small USB placed inside the old steel box Daniel had once knocked over in the basement. One rainy afternoon, I called Quinn. We talked for nearly an hour. She told me, Riley loved Chopin, especially Nocturne No. 20. Every time she was sad, she'd play it and sit for hours in the living room. I froze. That piece. I've always listened to it whenever I felt lost. No one ever taught me that. But maybe the things that run in your blood don't need to be taught. I began writing everything down in a small notebook, not to share with anyone, but to remind myself. I had once been robbed. But I had taken it back. Not the money, but the identity. Every day I walked a loop around the small park near our home, where kids played on slides and the elderly did Tai Chi in silence. I no longer tried to reclaim an old family. I was learning how to live without needing one. That night, as Daniel held me from behind, he whispered, "Do you feel better now?" I nodded. Not completely. But for the first time, I don't feel like I need anyone's approval. I closed my eyes. In the darkness, I knew one thing clearly. I no longer dreamt of someone else holding my life for me. I had taken it back. The official trial took place on a gray, heavy morning in mid-January, as if Morgantown itself could feel the weight of what was about to unfold. I sat at the plaintiff's table beside Lawrence, my calm, steady lawyer, though today I could see tension in his eyes. Daniel sat quietly behind me. On the other side, Carol and Richard looked more worn than ever. My mother wore a gray sweater, her fingers clutching prayer beads. My father kept his usual stoic face, but today, he wouldn't meet my gaze. Jaden wasn't present. When the judge entered, I exhaled. Not to calm myself, but to remind myself. This was real, not a dream anymore. Lawrence presented clearly. My client was never informed of her rights as the trust beneficiary and had no decision-making power regarding the disbursement of 30% of the fund at age 18. That money was misused, primarily to benefit another family member of the defendants. He paused, then looked directly at the judge. We request 1. Full reimbursement of the misappropriated 30%, with 5% annual interest from the time of use until now. 2. If the defendants cannot repay, we propose liquidation of assets, or shares from Miller Holdings, to fulfill this obligation. 3. The remaining 70% of the trust to be transferred directly to the account of the rightful beneficiary, Ms. Abigail Harper Miller, as originally stipulated by Riley and Julian. The opposing lawyer argued that Mr. and Mrs. Miller raised Abigail for nearly 3 decades with love and sacrifice, that every investment was made in the spirit of family, and that dividing assets now would severely impact the company run by Jaden Miller. I lifted my head, my voice steady. No one asked them to take my birth parents' money and invest it in my brother. I didn't steal anything. I'm just reclaiming what never should have been taken. The pivotal moment came with Quinn's testimony. She entered slowly but resolutely. I was Riley Harper's best friend, she began. I know Riley created this trust before that fateful trip, with one clear wish. If anything happened to her and Julian, everything would go to their daughter, Abigail. She paused, her voice cracking. I once held that baby in my arms. I promised Riley I'd always look after her, but after the funeral, when I tried to reach out, Carol and Richard had vanished, taking her with them. The room fell silent. The judge looked at me, then the case file. After a few moments, he declared, "The court recognizes Abigail Harper Miller as the sole beneficiary of the trust. The defendants are required to terminate guardianship and repay the misused 30%, with 5% annual interest. In the event of non-payment, partial liquidation of Miller Holdings assets or shares is authorized. The remaining 70% of the trust shall be transferred to the beneficiary's account within 30 days. I nodded, eyes unblinking. In that moment, I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel angry. I just felt strangely calm. For the first time in my life, people had to listen to me, as me, not as the version they wanted me to be. 3 days after the trial, I received official notice from Marston and Green Bank. The equivalent of 70% of the trust value had been transferred to the account under my name. The document included a single, brief line: Riley and Julian Harper Memorial Trust. Transfer completed. I read and reread that name. For the first time in my life, I saw my birth parents' full names printed on a financial document, not as whispered stories, not as part of some vague family secret, but as living, official proof. They had existed. And they had left something for me. Lawrence contacted me the very next day to discuss the remaining 30%. The defendants had made no offer to repay in cash, meaning the court could move forward with liquidation of Miller Holdings shares. But I didn't want the company dismantled. I had thought long and hard, and in the end, I chose to retain the 48% share, as previously proposed by the court, not because I wanted control, but because I wanted responsibility, something no one in that family had ever rightly given me. That afternoon, I received a call I didn't expect. Carol. I almost didn't answer. But Daniel looked at me and simply said, "Let it be your choice, how it ends." I nodded. On the other end, her voice was hoarse and slow. "I know. I have no right to ask for forgiveness, but I still want to talk, if you'll allow it." I agreed to meet at a small cafe outside town. She arrived first, wrapped in a thick coat, her hair grayer than the last time I'd seen her. When I sat down, she clutched her teacup tightly, eyes down. "I once thought that if I loved you enough, I could cover everything. Cover the wrong, the fear, the past I didn't want to face." I didn't interrupt. "But I forgot," she continued, "that you didn't need to be shielded from the truth. You needed to know the truth so you could grow up on your own." I looked her in the eye. "I grew up, but not because you allowed me to." She nodded, silent. "I still hope you'll stay in touch, even if just occasionally. I don't expect forgiveness, but I hope for redemption." I sipped my coffee, voice calm. "I won't cut ties. But I won't call anyone else mother again. Not because I hate you, but because I spent too many years calling the wrong person by that name." She bowed her head, hiding her eyes. I stood. "Before I left, I said, 'You can make amends, but you can't erase the scars.' I'll be fine. But from now on, I live as the daughter of Riley and Julian. No one else." I walked out of the cafe, cold wind brushing my collar, but not enough to make me shiver. For the first time in my life, I wasn't looking for answers in someone else's eyes. I had written my name anew, with identity, with voice, with the silence that mattered, and by choosing not to blame, but to let go. A week after meeting with Carol, I received an email from Miller Holdings' office. The subject line read simply, "Internal meeting, official shareholder." Below it was Jaden's signature. I thought for a long time before replying. Not because I was hesitant, but because I wanted to be clear on who I'd be when I walked in. Not the youngest sibling hoping for approval, not someone collecting debts, but a shareholder, an equal. The meeting room on the 6th floor of Miller Holdings hadn't changed much. Drop ceiling, long dark wood table, half-pulled curtains. Jaden was already there. He was neatly dressed, but not overly formal. No tie, no dark blue suit, just a white shirt and a tired look in his eyes. When I entered, he stood, pulled out my chair, then sat across from me. Between us was a thick folder stamped 48% shareholder. Jaden spoke first. "I know you have the right to withdraw your shares or convert them to cash, but I hope you'll consider staying." I didn't answer immediately. He went on. I won't pretend I understand everything. But after the trial, I read through the entire trust file. And your mother's letter, your real mother. She clearly stated she wanted it all for you. There's no room for debate. I nodded. I know. He looked at me, this time without looking away. I'm sorry, he said. Not just for the money, but because I once believed you always had too much, when in reality, you had nothing at all. I tightened my fingers, not out of anger, but because those words, even now, struck a strange, quiet ache. I don't need you to carry anything for me, I said. I just need you to see me clearly, like now. We sat in silence for a moment. Then I added, I won't withdraw from the company, but I won't intervene in operations either. I'm keeping the shares, not for control, but as a reminder that from now on, anyone who uses what my parents left behind will have to remember me. Jaden nodded. I understand. And, if you're willing, I want to include your name in the re-founding statement, so the company isn't tied to just one side of the family. I was surprised, but didn't show it. I simply smiled, calm and light. That's up to you. I don't need people to remember who I am. I just need to stop reminding myself that I was invisible. As I stood to leave, Jaden called out, Abigail? I turned. If one day, you're willing, maybe we can start over, as two adults, not two kids, stuffed into the same broken family. I paused, then said slowly, not start over, but maybe start differently. I stepped out of the building. The sky was blue, sunlight spilling softly across the granite steps. I didn't need to beat anyone. I didn't need anyone to lose. I just needed, from now on, for every step I take, to be mine alone. No one else holding the map of my life. One early morning in February, I woke up earlier than usual. Daniel was still asleep, his head tilted slightly to the left, the habit he'd had since college. I slipped on a robe and stepped out onto the balcony. The sky was pale blue, mist stretching over the distant hills. No rush, no heaviness. Just a morning like any other. But for me, it was the first of a new life, no longer defined by someone else's past. I made 2 cups of coffee, one for myself. The other, I placed on the windowsill beside a framed photo of Riley and Julian. A photo Quinn had sent in her final envelope. They were smiling, holding hands, sunlight filtering through their hair. I never knew them in real life, but I knew that smile wasn't staged. And for the first time, I could look at their faces, without feeling hollow, without anger. Only warmth. I whispered, I got it all back. Not the assets, but the name. The truth. The right to speak for myself. A tear fell, not from pain, but relief, like shedding a layer of ash long settled on my chest. I opened the drawer and took out the notebook I had filled over the past few months. The last page was blank. But this morning, I knew exactly what to write. I wrote, Abigail Harper Miller. Born of Riley and Julian. Raised in silence, but reborn in truth. I do not regret the years I was forgotten, for they taught me to remember who I am. A few weeks later, Daniel and I returned to Boston, not to escape, but to begin anew. I applied for a master's program in estate and inheritance law, not because of the lawsuit, but because I realized there are too many people like me, once blinded by the label of family. I want to help them see the light again. We passed by Riley and Julian's old house, now occupied by someone else, but I wasn't sad. What belonged to me I had taken with me, in my heart, in my memory, in my choices. I don't live to avenge the past. I live to write what's right in the present. My story isn't about revenge. It's about reclaiming myself from things once too elusive to name. Silence, concealment, wounds shaped like kinship. If you've ever been treated like your worth was the excess in someone else's life, remember, you are not invisible. You don't need someone's approval to exist. It took me nearly 3 decades to reclaim my name. You don't have to wait that long. If this story resonates with you, even a little, leave a comment below. I'd love to know where you're watching from and if you've ever had to fight to be yourself. And if you know someone who needs to hear this, please share it with them. And don't forget to like and subscribe. Thank you for listening. I'm Abigail Harper Miller, and this is my truth.